Or if you're, UFO person and it's all nuts and bolts and there's no Psi, it's almost like we all have these, blinders on and we're all kind of siloed in our own respective worldviews, which is understandable. So I think that was really the biggest eye opener to me, was that, like, wait a minute, like, what do you mean you never had a dream that's come to fruition? Like, what do you mean your grandma doesn't, like, know when something's going on with you and calls you and that kind of a thing?
Welcome to the Cosmosis Conversations. I'm Kelly Chase. If you've been following my work for a while, you probably know me as the host of the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast. But this is something new. This is the next evolution. With the Cosmosis Conversations, we're building something bigger. Ontacalypse Productions is growing, and with it, our ability to create thoughtful, elevated, and deeply human-centered media that explores the questions at the bleeding edge of human discovery. Questions that push us to consider the nature of our reality and ourselves. And speaking of evolution, our new docuseries, Cosmosis, UFOs A New Reality, is finally out. The response has been overwhelming, and we couldn't be more grateful. But there's so much more to explore. That's why we created this podcast, so we can go even deeper into the concepts, stories, and voices from the show. You don't need to have seen the docuseries to follow along, but we hope you'll check it out. It's available on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, Fandango at Home, Vimeo, and more. You can find all the links at cosmosis.media. And I'm not doing this alone. Joining me as co-host is J. Christopher King, director of the Experiencer Group, co-creator of the Inquire Anomalous Conference Series, and someone who has been at the forefront of research and community building around this phenomenon for years.
Thanks, Kelly. It's wonderful to be here, and I couldn't be more excited to help bring the Cosmosis Conversations to life. This is more than a podcast. It's an opportunity to expand the conversation, to interrogate the phenomenon from every angle, to sit with its complexity, and to challenge ourselves to think bigger. And today, we're doing exactly that. Our first guest is Courtney Leffall, one of the compelling experiencers featured in our docuseries. This is the first time he's ever told his story publicly, and it's one that encapsulates the true nuance of the phenomenon, something that extends far beyond UFOs. It's about our humanity, about our connection to the dead. It's about nothing less than the full breadth of our own potential. If you want to go deeper into Cosmosis and support this work, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get perks like early access to ad-free episodes, monthly Zoom calls with us and our special guests, and more. You can join at patreon.com/cosmosismedia. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Your engagement helps us reach more people and keeps these conversations going. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. It really does help the algorithm, and more importantly, we love hearing from you. Now let's get into it. Before we dive into our conversation with Courtney, here's a clip from Cosmosis, UFOs A New Reality that will give you a little more background on his remarkable story. If you're listening on the audio podcast and want to see the clip, there's a link to the video on YouTube in the episode description. Here we go.
When our family was brought from Africa, they were brought up to Houston County, and they were bought by the family that used to own this property that we're sitting on. And so we had been looking for this land for a long time because I had ancestors who had died there during slavery. My grandmother even picked cotton there, as a kid, but we kind of had lost where this location was. And so it was a significant part of our family history to be able to tie the whole story back together. After my son was born, I kind of went on this rabbit hole of trying to build out my family history and find all of my ancestors and trace them all the way back to slavery. And I knew where pretty much everyone else was, with the exception of an ancestor who had died during slavery on a plantation. Then one day, my son, who's about 3 at the time, had a dream, and he woke up in the middle of the night, and he was almost in a trance-like state. And he said, I saw my grandfather. I'm thinking he's talking about like my wife's dad, because he had just come and stayed with us. I was like, you saw Papa Willie? He's like, no, it was my grandfather. And I'm like, he's talking about my dad? He's like, no. And I said, who did you see? What was he doing? He said, well, he was my grandfather, and he was in the house, and the house was on fire, and he couldn't get out, and he was sad because he wanted to see you. And he said that he has something he wants to tell you, but he died in the fire.
And when he said that to me, I immediately just started crying because I knew who he was talking about. And my great grandfather was a Southern gentleman, a leader in the church and a leader in the community. And he did die in a house fire shortly after I was born. And he never got to see me in the hospital.
And so for him to tell that story at 3 years old, we never introduced the concept of great-great-grandparents. We never told him this story. He's barely articulate, but he's explaining something that we know is true.
But at that moment, I knew who it was, and I knew he had a message for me, but I also still felt like I didn't want him to come to me and present himself to me, because I still think that would freak me out. And so I knew it was real, and I knew it was there, and it probably wasn't for another 7 months before, I got up the courage to ask him to tell me what he wanted to tell me.
And so fast forward to Father's Day, I found myself at the cemetery in front of his tombstone. So I just said, hey, I'm here. I heard you had something you want to tell me. What do you want to tell me? And I just hear clear as day, by the little red house. And that was all I heard, by the little red house.
We were looking for real estate at the time, a vacation home, but it turns out we had one little listing of a little red house on some acreage not too far away from that cemetery. So I reached out to my realtor and told him, hey, take everything else off the list. The only thing I want to look at is this little red house. Like, I don't know what is up with it, but I need to look at this little red house. My realtor set up a date for us to go look at the property. And I mean, it was like way out in the middle of nowhere. You got to drive miles down a dirt road to get there. And when we get there, he says, oh, wait, I think we're at the wrong place. And I'm like, why do you say that? He said, because my GPS says we're at a cemetery. And I'm like, a cemetery? And he showed me the name of the cemetery. And I just instinctively knew at that moment where we were, because I had always been told that the name of the family who owned our family as slaves, and that if we ever found that cemetery, we would find where our ancestors were buried and also find the place where they lived. We get up to the property and we knock on the door, and then the guy answers and says, sorry, I don't know what y'all are doing here. This place is not for sale. This must be a mistake. I'm not looking to sell this place. You might want to go talk to a neighbor or talk to someone else. Kind of knew in the back of my mind where we were, and so I asked him, is there a creek that kind of runs in the back of the property? And he was like, well, yeah, there is. And I was like, I named the creek, and I said, is this creek? And he was like, yeah, it's actually that creek. And he's like, well, how do you know that? And I told him a story about how my grandmother used to pick cotton on a place along this creek, and they had to follow the creek all the way back to our family's property. And that struck up a conversation between us, and we talked for a while. And eventually he let us tour the property on an ATV. He still said, look, I'm still not selling, but if you want to go back there and see and just confirm, and he let us do that. Maybe a couple of weeks later, to our surprise, our realtor reaches out and says that the guy decided that he actually wants to sell us the place. And he wrote me this beautiful handwritten letter, and basically said that after meeting me, he felt compelled to sell us this place, and that he wanted me to be able to spend time with my son there and build those memories together. After this kind of wild series of events, I'm now the owner, and my grandmother is also the owner of the land where our family was once enslaved and where she once picked cotton. And I don't really know how to explain it, but I felt like we were led there. And so you can imagine, this ranch, at least to us, is a special place. And it has an energy, and you can feel it. And we've had a history in our family of anomalous experiences, and they still continue at the ranch. For most people, they see a door swing open, or they turn around and an object is moved or missing. They see it as a scary experience. And frankly, at first I did too. But now, especially if I'm at the ranch, I see it a little differently. It's almost like I recognize who or what that might be, and
what type of message they may be trying to communicate. And by and large, I think that they're happy that we're there and that they are glad that we're stewarding the property.
Hey, Courtney, it's so great to see you. How are you?
Doing great, Kelly. It's good to see you guys too.
Well, we've been dying to catch up with you. I know so much has happened since the show released, and we want to talk about all of it. Before we start, for people who've seen the show or maybe haven't seen the show, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, who are you? What's your background? Where are you from?
Yeah. So born and raised in Texas. By profession, I'm a financial planner, certified financial planner, working as a investment advisor and planner for individual clients. Background, I'm just a regular guy. I play the piano at my church. Have 3 kids. I met my wife at summer camp when I was 12 years old. Had a crush on her. She didn't like me, and now we've been married almost 15 years with 3 kids. And so I played college football. Play sports growing up. I would say just kind of a normal Texas kid.
Very cool. So what has it been like for you since the show came out? Because, like you said, you're a normal Texas guy, family guy. What has it been like to tell this story publicly? What's the response been like? And how does your family feel about it?
Yeah, good question. What's it been like? I guess it's just kind of been a load off, to be honest with you. It's like, the past, maybe really my whole life, right? You've kind of had these types of experiences and you don't necessarily always know when and who and how to talk about it. And especially the stuff we shared in Cosmosis is pretty complex. And I thought you guys did a great job of being able to articulate it in a really thoughtful way. So I think it's just been a load off to be able to get it out there and just, get it off your chest. Seeing the reaction has been overwhelmingly positive. Obviously, I've had, some people reach out to me directly and talk about how the story inspired them and how there's parallels that they've seen. And I think that's, in many ways, not that we necessarily needed confirmation, but confirmation in the sense that you're doing the right thing, going down the right path, right? I think the last thing I wanted to do in sharing the story would be, to, add confusion, to lead people astray, for lack of a better term. I think, just being able to add to the conversation, share our story, and if people find it inspiring, that's obviously, a win. As far as my family's reception to it, I think, my family likes it, loves it. My mom was really pleased, grandma's pleased, but it hasn't really been like a huge topic of conversation, probably because we live it, we have lived it, right? So it's kind of like, oh, what do people think of the documentary? It's like, oh, it's number 2 on Apple TV. Well, that's great. What's for dinner? It's kind of one of those type of things. So yeah, there hadn't been much about it, but I think that's, I think I will say this, I think there is a sense of pride, especially I've seen some of my other cousins who are a little bit more distant to the story, but just being able to see the family pride and the family history. And the other thing that's come out is, having one-on-one conversations where people start sharing more stories, with me directly about some of the same, individuals that we talk about in the series. And it's like, okay, well, it really just adds more confirmation and complexity to just the overall experience to know that, okay, well, while your son is having this experience with, a deceased ancestor, there's a cousin also having an interaction, maybe years before, years after, or whatever. So that's really interesting as well.
It is interesting. It's fascinating. I mean, we should probably really get into that a bit. What has it been like growing up in a family, for the audience out there? We've talked about this a bit, but what was it like growing up in a family where Psi and paranormal phenomena were seen as commonplace, really?
I don't really know, because that's the only family I grew up in, right? So it's like, I think the shock is more that more people genuinely don't believe this stuff, right? Like I guess that was what was shocking for me, is to recognize that even within the UFO community, right? Or, paranormal communities, Bigfoot community, whatever, religious communities even, right? It's almost like there's a lot of acceptance of some, but not all or other, types of phenomena, right? It's, and I think that just spreads itself all the way across society, regardless if you're a science person and you don't believe any of it, or you're a religious person and you only believe, if it didn't happen in the Bible, then it never happened. Or if you're, a UFO person and it's all nuts and bolts and there's no psi, it's almost like we all have these, blinders on, and we're all kind of siloed in our own respective worldviews, which is understandable. So I think that was really the biggest eye opener to me, was that, like, wait a minute, like, what do you mean you never had a dream that's come to fruition? Like, what do you mean your grandma doesn't, like, know when something's going on with you and calls you and that kind of a thing? So that's probably the most shocking thing for me.
Yeah, speaking of your grandma, there's so many things in making Cosmosis that, like, some of our very favorite parts ended up on the cutting room floor. And something I wish we'd been able to show more of was her story. Getting to meet her was absolutely incredible. She's the matriarch of your family, an incredibly strong, intelligent woman who has lived one heck of a life. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about her for people to let them kind of understand what kind of a lady she is and what her life has been like?
The one story that always kind of sticks out in my mind when I think about my grandma is, and people on the internet may not believe me when I tell you this, but it's, just factual. She's the type of person that loves everybody, like loves all the animals. Like, I mean, she'd adopt any animal as long as it wasn't a reptile. She's cool with it. Like, any kids that had, issues in their home, maybe they had physical differences. I mean, that was just the place that, her house was. Everyone was welcome, and you never knew who was going to be over there, who she was going to be keeping, or what animal was going to show up. And there was a period of time where she used to keep these two boys, and they were a little bit younger than I was. And their dad was actually in the Ku Klux Klan, and he would drop them off at the house to go to the Klan rallies. And my grandmother would babysit his kids while he would literally, go to a KKK rally. And, we'd be outside playing, and like my view is like, hey, let's just play basketball, soccer. I don't care. Like, as long as let's have fun. And so one day we're outside in the front yard playing soccer, and it's me and my cousin and these two little boys, a little bit younger than us. And my grandma said, hey, she came to the door and said, hey, dinner's ready, come on in, and have dinner. And of course, no kid wants to come in while they're playing, right? And so they're like, we're not coming in. We don't want to come in. And she's like, yeah, you got to come in. The dinner's ready. It's time to eat. And she's like, well, I'm not coming in, you N-word. And like, I mean, my eyes were as bigger than yours, Kelly. I was like, oh, this is something's about to go down here. And my grandma comes out of it. She comes from the front porch, kind of, I don't even say storms down, but like walks down to the front yard. And she, walks up to him and, gets in his space, not in like aggressive way, but, in an authoritative way. And says, she says, I'm just trying to, it's a little emotional for me. I apologize. But she says to them, why would you call me that? And he says, well, we don't want to go inside and repeated the word, we don't want to go inside with you N-words. And she says to him, well, if I'm an N-word, then that means you are an N-word lover. And for those that are familiar with the KKK, that's like the worst thing you can call someone in that organization. It's like an N-word lover. And he's like, I'm not an N-word lover. And she's like, yes, you are. You're an N-word lover because I know that you love me. And he's like, well, I'm not an N-word lover. And she said, well, if you're not an N-word lover, then I'm not an N-word because you love me and I love you. So if you love me, then I can't be that word unless you're an N-word lover. And so he kind of stopped and thought about it. And he said, well, if I can't call you that, what should I call you? And she said, call me Granny. And then from that point on, they called her Granny. And, fast forward, the dad actually ended up leaving the KKK and getting out. He had issues and stuff like that too. But I think that one, story kind of encompasses who she is as a person, probably more than any other one story I can think of. And this is a person who was born in 1940 and grew up in segregation and Jim Crow and the whole 9 yards. And for her to have that type of reaction, and then for our family to build a relationship with them, over years, I think says a lot about who she is as a person.
Wow.
Absolutely. That's absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that, Courtney. And, folks that have watched Cosmosis have seen the story of you finding the ranch. And we actually, for those of us that are watching in the future in the audience, those watching in the future in the audience, they had just seen this clip of you finding the ranch, and that whole story, right? And so there is the context that your grandma did pick cotton in that area, and maybe even on that very property when she was a small child. But you guys lost records of where that was, and she was a small child then. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what was the story there, and how did you lose kind of like where that area was? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so, I'll try to give a little clarity. I think this also tells you a little bit about my grandmother, right? So our family owned land in that town, but they still would also go and pick cotton, and that was, a way to generate extra income, right? My grandma was notorious in the family for like being the one who would like, she's like, I didn't even want to pick no cotton. I'd just go pick a few enough to fill up my sack, and I would go lay under the tree and like, sleep, and so she's always kind of been that defiant kind of character figure. And she's, the oldest girl, at least that survived, in the family. So, she was old enough to kind of remember a lot of this place. And there was a lot of stories that they would tell us, right? So they told us about one time they were out there picking cotton, and this is like, sunset, and you're out in like deep East Texas, and not a place you want to be, caught after dark. And they would drive them back to the kind of the family farm. And I guess the, landowners didn't pick them up that day, and just was like, we're just gonna leave them out in the field, and, no way home. And so they followed the creek back to the property. And it was always this kind of family story. They even made up a song, and like they would pass that song down to us, and she always told a story about how her mother, even though it was a really scary experience, she made it fun for them, right? Like, even though they're going through the woods in the middle of the night and trying to figure out how to get back home and not getting caught, and she, sang them songs. And so it was always a story that kind of passed down that she always told us when we were kids. And so there, certain geological things about the property that, we knew that had been told. The other thing she always told us was, and at the time it didn't make a lot of sense, but she was like, oh, we used to have to climb this mountain to go pick cotton. I'm like, Granny, what are you talking about? Like, there's no mountains in East Texas. Like, what are you talking about? There's no mountain. But this is how she's told the story. And, come to find out, the property is actually in one of the highest elevations in that county, right? So to her, from a person who'd never been outside that county, that was effectively a mountain in her mind as a child, right? So there was all these little details about, the property that had been passed out. From a logistical standpoint, the county, the roads actually changed. And so there were roads that actually, went from our property down to that property that no longer exist, right? So roads changed. And so there are all these little details that we know about. And, one of the things that we knew, or at least my grandmother told me, was the name of the family who they were picking cotton for. And, the name of kind of the guy that oversaw, the kind of the field workers, if you will. And, she'd always told me that family name. Actually, she waited till I was older to tell me the name, because she was like, she didn't want to necessarily, she didn't necessarily feel that family was just like purely bad, evil people. I think that's the perception a lot of people have of slave owners, people that own, it had sharecroppers and things like that. She felt like that family, at least for the time period, treated at least our family relatively good. And there's a lot of historical stories I could tell you about that. But that may come up in the conversation. So anyway, she never really wanted to tell me the name of that family because she didn't want, as an early age when you're learning about this stuff, I think a lot of people have some anger and resentment. And I think she kind of wanted to wait until all that stuff passed and I was old enough and mature enough to know, like, okay, there's more to this story. So when I got older, she actually told me the name of the family, told me, that there was a cemetery with that family's name and some of the people that were there. And she's like, if you ever find that cemetery and find these individuals, then you'll find where our family was originally held as slaves and that whole thing. But, the roads had changed, people had moved, to the city. So, but that was always in the back of my mind. So when we got to the spot where we were looking for property and we got to that property, when we pulled up to the gate, the realtors stopped and he was like, hey, I think we're at the wrong place. I'm like, what do you mean? He says the name of the cemetery. And I instantly knew, like, oh, that's the family that my grandmother told me about. And so that was really how, like, the pieces of the puzzle kind of got connected in my mind. And then, of course, as we're driving up to the ranch, you go up this, steep, long hill. And so it's like, oh, yeah, I could imagine walking up this thing in 100 degrees in the summertime. Like, this probably feels like a mountain to you, And the same thing with the creek in the back. And so it just started to add back to that. The puzzle pieces started adding up to me.
It's a fascinating story. Your grandma, something that was so cool about meeting her and about spending time with your family was really understanding how she was able to create kind of a safe space for your family with regard to psi abilities and paranormal phenomena, something that she had experienced her whole life. And those experiences had been tough for her. It had made her feel different and that she had suffered in a lot of ways. She described her gifts and abilities as a blessing and a curse. And yet she was able to kind of create a space within your family for the younger generations to feel safe talking about those things. Can you talk a little bit about, your relationship with your grandma and how that kind of opened you up to kind of the strangeness in your own life?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll give you a little more context. My mom had me when she was 19. She was a freshman in college at Texas A&M University. And so she was finishing up school. So my grandmother really kind of raised me as her own, those first, 4 or 5 years of life. And so, in many ways, I think our relationship is a lot closer than grandmother, grandson. Additionally, I'm the oldest child in my generation. So I was the firstborn grandson. I was a boy, so I was closer to a child of hers than a grandchild of hers, if that makes any sense. And I think, a lot of things she told me about was, like, for example, she talked about how when she was a kid, they called her a witch. Her first name, I guess she's on the show. So her first name is Hazel. And so they, would tease her and call her Witch Hazel, right? Because, she had these abilities and she would see things. And I think at that time, in that time period, in that cultural context, people didn't know how to process it. It was like, I don't want to necessarily say they thought it was demonic, but it was, a witch or witchcraft or something, not to be desired. And so I think that really did have an impact on her, particularly when there are, things that she might discover of like a murder or something, and they go out in the woods and they find a body, and, how do you reconcile that kind of a thing? So I think for her, those experiences are what led her to say, like, I want to make sure that I don't, allow that same type of stigma to happen, to the next generations.
Yeah, and it is something that your family seems to have experienced over generations. Can you talk a little bit about the things that were kind of commonplace for you and your family growing up?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it to stuff that I personally experienced, just because I know it's, I don't know, I feel like when you're telling someone else's story, you might not get it right, but I can just talk about stuff that I experienced. Like, I remember this is in college. I remember I was playing football, and we had a football practice. I ended up tackling this really, big guy who ended up going to the NFL. And I literally, I mean, they call them stingers, right? Where you just lose sensation in your whole arm. And it was just like, I was kind of pretty much done with practice. I couldn't move my arm. I was like, you know, um, it was a pretty tough hit, right? And so as soon as I get back in the locker room, my phone rings. Like, as soon as I'm walking to my locker, right? Like my phone rings and it's my grandma. So I answer it and she didn't even say hi or, hey, how you doing? She's like, what happened to your arm? And I'm like, what? I was like, did my coach call you? She was like, no, no one called me. I saw it. Like, what happened to your arm? Is your arm okay? Like, what's going on? And it would be stuff like that would happen that you can't, you know, articulate. And I even asked the coach and he's like, no, like that's, we're not going to call your grandma in the middle of practice. Even if they did, they would call my mom, not my grandma. Right. So it was things like that. Another thing that I remember happening, and that this starts to kind of make more sense now. I call her my twin cousin because we were born 6 months apart, but we grew up as pretty much siblings with my grandma. And there were nights where we would have the same dream. Like we would dream like we're out flying somewhere and we describe the same things. And then like my grandma would be in the dream and like we all wake up and like could corroborate each other's stories. And I always just thought it was just a dream, right? Until I have a son and then she has a daughter and they're 6 months apart essentially. And then they start having those same type of dreams and they live, 60 miles apart. And then they describe things that are in each other's dreams. And I hop on the phone with her, like, what did your daughter say? What my son? And like, they don't even know each other are saying these things. And then there's things that we can validate that are factual that happen in real life to make us feel like, oh, wait, they're probably that was something other than a dream. And it corroborates what we experience as children too. Right. And so there's just things like that. And I could go on and on and on, but it's just a lot of things like that just would happen.
That's fascinating. And that's the kind of veridical anecdotal evidence that has such weight to it that, I mean, that's kind of the meat or one of the main kind of thrusts of a text like Surviving Death, which is like a huge classic by Leslie Kean. It's a lot about veridical anecdotal evidence. And this is a situation where you've got a veridical anecdotal evidence. And it reminds me of, for example, the very popular podcast these days, the Telepathy tapes, where people talk about the Hill and these non-speaking autistic folks, the often children, report kind of meeting in a land, whether people think of that as the consciousness field or the astral plane or heaven or what have you. There's this idea that folks can meet, people can meet somewhere in an adjacent realm to us that's not in the physical. And in that situation where it really is the dream life, but you come back with takeaways that you can kind of remark upon. It also reminds me of places like the DMT realms, where people will report having similar experiences or even seeing similar figures, and they'll hear conversation or story or like data points that nobody else knows, and then they'll find another experiencer of that space that has that data as well. It's fascinating. If you wouldn't mind, and if it's not breaching any kind of secrecy, I mean, this is just fascinating stuff. Can you remember any specific like details from either your situation when you were younger in a kind of shared dream space, or anybody else in the families, that would kind of paint the picture a little bit more clear for the audience?
Yes. Okay. So I think the stuff that I experienced, and I can share some of it. I think what was at the time, I just thought it was a dream. I just thought me and my cousin had the same dream. That's cool. That was the extent of it. So it wasn't something I necessarily wanted to hold on to remember, but I do remember one where there's this bridge in Dallas that kind of takes you from our side of Dallas where we live to another side of Dallas. And in between is the Trinity River, right? Which is this huge river that goes all the way down the Gulf of Mexico. And sometimes that river will flood and the banks will, overcome. And I just remember that I would have to go across that bridge every day to go to school. And so in one of the dreams, it was like this dream that the river had overflowed the banks and that the road had gotten flooded out and that it was like dangerous to go to school because that area is going to be flooded. And I just remember my cousin was with me, and then my grandma was there, and I don't remember all the details, but I just remember it was almost like this warning thing. And then sure enough, the river ends up flooding, and like the whole area that I had dreamt about ended up flooding. And we didn't have like a catastrophic issue or anything. And I think it was partially because we had all dreamt the same thing. And like, we're like, okay, this is probably a sign or a signal. But I mean, stuff like that would happen, so it wasn't like, you know, abnormal. Like, I'll give you this morning, okay? This morning, I dropped the kids off at school. And so it's been cold. Today was like the first day. It's like nice and warm. Like yesterday was like 80 degrees. So this morning I'm like, hey, Logan, why don't you just, I'll pull up, I'll drop you off at the corner and you can get out and walk to school. And like, you can get some steps in and I'll walk with you. And so I'm walking with them and he's like, no, Daddy, I can do it by myself. Like, I got this. I can do it. And like, this will be like his first day. It's the 100th day of school, I think, for them. Right. And, it's his first day, like walking by himself. And so I'm like, all right, cool. You got this, man. And so I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go hop back in the car and I'll just, let you go do your thing. And something like tells me to like not go back the same way to our house, because the school is in the neighborhood. Like, it's like I could run to the school without stopping, right? So it's just like right there. Like, no, I need to make a U-turn and just follow Logan in the car, right? And so I'm just kind of following alongside of him in the car. And I'm just kind of watching, almost like a proud dad watching your kid go off, and he's in kindergarten, right? So, and I have the right of way to go through the crossing guards, letting all the cars come through. But I stop, because I'm watching Logan, because I just want to see, I'm like just in proud dad mode. And because I stop, all the other cars, that are still coming down the road, I think they assume that it was time to stop. But Logan wasn't paying attention. He starts walking across the crosswalk, and there's like a sign. So it's almost like if you're coming this way, you probably couldn't see him because there's a light pole and like a school sign or whatever. So it's kind of obstructs the view. So he's like walking out into the middle of the street. The crossing guard's flagging everybody to keep coming because he's looking the other direction. And as soon as he steps into the street, the other car it's like he saw my car stopping. So he assumed that he was supposed to stop too. And then the car stopped. And then Logan walks across the street and the crossing guard like freaks out and like tells him to go back and they come back. But it's like, okay, maybe that's just happenstance. But what if I had gone the other direction and I'm not in this big, 2,500 Chevy truck stopping, in the middle of the street, slowing down traffic? Does he get hit by a car this morning? I don't know, But I just think those types of things happen. I think it happens to all of us, frankly. And I just think it's, do you listen and do you turn around and go the other way, the opposite direction of, where you're supposed to go? Or do you, just continue on your normal path? And I just think our family is the type that those little voices or signs or inclinations, I think we're just a little bit more inclined to pay attention to it because you've experienced the times when it, pans out well for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of stories about parents in particular having some intuition about their child. It seems like that's not unheard of, right? And if you are someone who's more inclined to listen to those voices, or not necessarily voice, just those little intuitions that pop up. Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Your grandma, speaking of the telepathy tapes, if you don't mind telling the story, it's a really short one. But I know you had been listening to the telepathy tapes. And like you said, your grandma is like this really big-hearted person who took care of all kinds of kids. And she worked with special needs kids, including nonverbal autistic kids. Can you talk a little bit about what she said when you asked her about her experience with working with nonverbal autistic children?
Yeah. And I'll add to this, like, she didn't just work with them. Sometimes they stayed with us, right? Like, they would spend the night, stay for weeks at a time, whatever, every day. But I asked her, I said, Granny, I've listened to this telepathy tapes about, telepathy and people working with nonverbal kids. And sometimes they might experience telepathy. I said, did you ever have any situations like that where you experienced telepathy when working with kids? And she was like, well, how else was I supposed to potty train them? Like, because they like, and it was just like so matter of fact that she was almost offended that I asked her. Like, she's like, how else am I supposed to potty train these kids if I can't use telepathy, And I think, but what that said to me was just the practicality of it, right? Like, and then I thought, I'm like, well, how do you potty train a person who's nonverbally autistic and might be in a wheelchair and can't like completely articulate, can't control their body, but is still fully conscious, right? Like, might that be the only way that you can potty train, someone like that, right? And I look back and I was there, right? Like, some of these kids stayed with us and like had dinner with us and ate with us and, got potty trained with us, right? And I just remember her like sometimes giving that like a look and like you could tell she was communicating. Like you could tell they knew, and then like the parents would be like, I don't know why my kid, behaves like this with you guys. And like sometimes it wasn't like the parents abandoning the kids, they just knew that it was good for them to be around her. And so they would try to maximize that time, and their behavior would be improved, their quality of life would be improved. And I think at the time I just kind of assumed that's just great. And that's just that's who she is. That's what she does. Right. But I think it's now I recognize that there's a lot more to it than just, being a kind, warm-hearted person. I think she was communicating with those kids like 100%.
That is so fascinating.
I mean, she communicated with me sometimes. So I know she was communicating with them.
That's absolutely fascinating. And when you say that she was communicating with you, I assume you mean in a kind of mind-to-mind way. Is that what you mean? And
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
So I think when you got to understand it from this perspective too, like to telepathy tapes, I think there's all of the vernacular and language we have today about, how these communications happen. We didn't have that back then. I didn't grow up in that cultural context. Like I did, like telekinesis, like those weren't words necessarily that you use, right? But I would say the experience was that, right? Like I'll tell you, this is why, like, maybe like people are like, oh, this is so cool. Like your family, it's like, imagine having a psychic grandma and then getting in trouble at school. And like, she knows when you come home, like, and it's not like, it's the look of guilt on your face. It's like something else, and to the point to where you think it's your teacher calling on and telling on you, or you think it's your coach, saying you got hurt, or you thinking it's something else. It's this instant knowing where, like, there were times where I knew I did something I wasn't supposed to do, and I could look at her and she knew and I knew and we both knew, and it was like, okay, and maybe she acknowledged it, maybe she didn't, but you got the message, right? And sure, maybe you call that, a guilty conscience, maybe you want to call it that, but having experienced it and having experienced the verbal side of it, it's more than that, right? It's when you bring a friend over and that friend is not, exactly the type of person you should be hanging around, and your grandma could tell you every single thing about that person in 2 seconds, and she knows before and she's right. How do you explain that kind of stuff? Is it just discernment? Is it just intuition? Is it just, or is it something else? And I just kind of believe it's probably something else.
Thank you. There's one story that I can't resist. I have to ask, and if you don't feel comfortable sharing this,
sure,
it's absolutely okay. But when we were hanging out together in East Texas, and then afterwards, you were talking about this amazing situation back in the day where your grandma, speaking of people that you wouldn't necessarily want to be hanging out with, and intuition, and where's that coming from? Your mother or your grandmother used to do a little bit of work, a little bit of advisement, giving some information to folks from the FBI. Is that right? Would you feel comfortable talking about that a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. It didn't fit into the show, and it's exactly the kind of thing that we want to sit here and be able to kind of double click on, if you feel comfortable sharing with the audience about that. I'm curious.
So one of the things, so I talked about how she loved kids and animals, and she's still alive, right? Kids and animals. And if something was happening to a kid or even an animal, like it was like she had this heightened awareness about it. And so she would have dreams, right, about, things that are specifically happening to kids. And sometimes those dreams would be, you know, uh, call it premeditated, preemptive, whatever, precognitive. Um, and so it might be, hey, this child is about to get murdered, and I, need to do something or intervene, something, to happen. Sometimes sometimes she'd be able to influence it. A lot of times she wouldn't. It was almost like she couldn't do anything about it. And so she always said to me, at least, that she felt like she had this like obligation of like, okay, I saw this thing, I gotta try to prevent it. But it's almost this burden of you try to prevent it, but you can't. And so sometimes these things would happen. She'd get little details, and then she called the police. And in one case, she called the FBI, and at least it's her recounting the story to me. She called the FBI, and she was having these recurring dreams. She would see the same guy going around killing children. The guy ended up, being this child serial killer, and she would see these murders happening. And she even describes, I don't even know what you want to call this, but she's there, she's seeing him, and it was almost like he knew she could see her, but he would like taunt her, like, you can't catch me, kind of a thing. And she would try to get details and find little details, and then she shared that information back with the FBI. Long story short, they ended up catching this killer. And I'll be honest with you, Kelly, like, where do you put something like that? Like, if your grandma tells you this story, like, and you're like 12 years old, you're like, okay, granny, And I would say even there was some in the family that kind of felt like she'd make up stories, or she'd be lying, or she's embellishing something, right? And I just kind of was like, okay, maybe this is just it's too much, like, whatever. It wasn't until 2017, my grandfather passed away, and I was at the house helping her clean out a lot of his belongings, and I saw a letter from the FBI addressed to my grandmother, thanking her for her help in solving a case. And I just like freaked out and just like dropped the letter. Like, if I'd known we were going to be doing Cosmosis, I probably would have tried to take a picture of it or something. But it would just freak me out, because it was like, holy crap, like that really happened. The skeptic in me says, okay, well, maybe she called the FBI, gave them these tips, but maybe that wasn't really what she saw wasn't really what happened. But they just said thank you anyway, just as a courtesy, because you never know. Like, I don't know. All I know is I saw the letter, and it matched up with what my grandmother had told me. We tried to find the letter, we couldn't find it, but that was the last time. That was the last time I saw it, was about 2017. But yeah, that wasn't the only thing. Like, there were other times like that. Like, she told me one story. I wasn't there. I'm just telling you what she told me. She said that she had, I think it was like a dream about this woman being, I don't know if she's going to be killed or injured or something. And she got the phone number, like the phone number came through to her. So she calls this lady on the phone, like tells her about her dream. And like the lady didn't believe her and was like, why are you calling me? Whatever. And I guess whatever, my grandmother told her somehow like helped her avoid whatever the situation was. And then she called her back and was like, hey, you called me. I didn't believe you. I thought you were like making this up. Like, I don't know how you knew this, but, thank you for, telling me that. And it was just a lot of little stories like that. I mean, there's other people in my family too that have those kinds of dreams too. And so this is me going, just kind of giving my 2 cents. I'm not even sure that those dreams are necessarily intended to prevent the occurrence. Like, I think that may happen. From my conversations with a lot of people, like, a lot of times you can't prevent the occurrence, and that's the burden of having some of these gifts. But I just wonder, is it some type of like, are you on some type of plane where you can see, things that are transpiring? Is it the love and passion for kids that, you somehow, see these things? I don't know what it is, but it's real, and it happens. And it's not just one person it happens to. I think it happens to a lot of people, and they just probably don't call the phone number, or they don't call the FBI. Right.
Yeah. And I remember when we were down there that Grandma Net was referencing it, and I thought about it for months, and I know Kelly did as well, as a gift and a burden, that situation, right? A gift and a burden. And that really stuck with me. And it makes sense. And I'm sure it's a resonant feeling for a lot of, people that have enhanced psi abilities and other experiencers as well. And for those of you that might be listening, this is the Atlanta child murders case is a huge case for that period of history as far as serial killers go. There's a man named Wayne Williams who was responsible for at least 24 murders between 1979 and the early 80s. And it's amazing that your grandma had anything to do with that case. And, the idea that any of those data points might have helped in that case and that apprehension, is historic. I'm so glad that you found that letter. It's the kind of thing that, it's amazing because it probably didn't mean much to her, but it probably meant a lot to you and or the rest of the family to see that kind of corroboration, because it is easy to roll your eyes and things like that in certain situations that seem unbelievable, even in a family of profound experiencers.
Right.
So, yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that. Kelly, do you have the next question?
Yeah. What I love so much about your story is that it encompasses so many different aspects of the phenomenon, which made it easier for us to kind of unpack a lot of different parts of what it means to be an experiencer and to encounter the phenomenon and all of its different forms. We don't really have good answers for why, for example, your family seems to experience a lot more of these things than, probably your typical family does. I'd argue that probably, like you said, most families have some kind of a story like this. But you guys have a lot of them. And we don't really have good answers for why that happens in certain families or with certain people. But the other part of it that I find really fascinating is that there aren't just families or bloodlines where this happens, but there's very specific places. And the ranch that your family found, beyond just being significant to you guys, to your history, to your past, to your family, and a connection to ancestors that you had been actively looking for, but it also seems to be a place where high strangeness is sort of just emergent and ever present. And I wish that we had been able to go into more of that in the show. Can you share a little bit about kind of the other sorts of strange things that happen on this property?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say, first of all, I'm not even sure it's this property. I think it's like, I just think that deep East Texas part of the country is, anybody that's from there or that has experience there, like, they will tell you it is, creepy. It's ghosts, it's, goblins, it's Bigfoot sightings, it's UFO, it's all of it, right? And is that because of the Native American history there? I mean, there's a strong Native American presence there, even in our family. Is it because of, the trauma of slavery and, some of the killings and lynchings and things that happened there? Is it, I don't know, right? But I just think that region, I think there's something unique to that region. And then I think when you talk about this property, right? So it's historic in a lot of ways, right? Like, I mean, I've learned from one of my neighbors that Davy Crockett used to come back and go down in the creek and drink from the water. It was like one of the stops on the trail back there. So I think there's just a ton of history there. One of the things, and I was trying to figure out how to explain this story because it's just kind of mind blowing in some ways. So I'm driving to the ranch, and there you got to go up this windy, long road. I mean, you guys have been up, up there, and there's this huge cliff that's probably 50-foot drop, maybe, where it's like kind of a waterfall cliff kind of a thing, and there's a tree, probably 100-year-old tree that just had fallen, and it fell right in front of this area where the cliff is. So there's really no way for you to get around it. Like, I couldn't get over it with my truck. I couldn't drive around it because it's like, kind of a drop off on either side of it. And so the only way that I think was like, okay, I got to go walk up this hill, go walk all the way up to the ranch, probably probably about a mile or so, go get a chain, tie the chain around the tree, or actually I was going to just get the tractor and a chain and pull the tree out or whatever. So I walk all the way up to the hill. I was like, okay, I'll hop in the tractor, the big tractor, and pull it out. It'd be easy work. Tractor wouldn't start. So I'm like, oh, that's weird. All right, let me go. I'll just get the little tractor. It'll be a little bit harder work, but it's still a tractor. Like, go to the little tractor. Little tractor won't start. So I'm like, okay, I got a spare, 1,500 truck. It's a, light duty, half-ton pickup truck. I mean, I should still be able to, maybe kind of tie the chain to the truck and try to tow this thing out, or truck won't start. Then I go to I'm like, well, heck, I don't want to walk all the way back down this huge hill with this huge chain I gotta go try to figure out how to get this tree out of the way. I'll just hop on the ATV, and ride it back down hill, so at least I don't have to walk another mile in the heat and these chains or whatever. It won't start. So I'm like, crap, like the only thing, now I got this chain, and it's this long chain I'm going to use to wrap around the tree. And I'm like, well, I guess the only other option I have now is to take the chain, walk back down, hook it up to my truck that's already down there, and try to, pull it out with that, using that truck. So I'm walking down the hill, and it's this huge long chain. So like, I don't know, it's probably 30 feet, 40 feet, something like that. And so I wrap it around my body, right? Because it's too long to just drag down this hill. So I have this chain wrapped around my body. I got it on my arms, and like I'm walking down this road that's been here for 200 plus years, right? And it just like instantly, it was almost like this download of like, do you realize that you're at a slave plantation where your ancestors were once held as slaves? You're walking the very road that they walked down. You're in chains, and you're walking the opposite. Like you're walking out of the plantation, essentially, back towards the truck. And it's just like dawns on me. And then as I'm walking down, it was like, I don't know how to describe this. I know Tom talks about like this upsight or whatever you want to call it, but it was like I could see slaves walking up. It was almost like you were looking through time and like looking back 200 years and seeing, your ancestors having to walk up that hill in chains as you're walking down that hill in chains. And it was this moment where I felt like it was, for lack of a better term, like orchestrated in a way, and almost like an initiation of like, we want you to see kind of like what we went through, kind of a thing. And I don't think there's anything that you could have done other than this that would get me to go to a slave plantation and walk around with chains on. Like that's not like on my, to-do list, right? Like it's not something you would naturally do, but somehow that occurred and somehow that happened. And somehow I had this vision of like seeing this, and it was almost like it was a signal that you buying this property kind of was reversing what happened to them. And like they walked in chains, but I got to walk out, kind of a thing. And like that was like the symbolism to me. And it's funny because if any other tree had fallen, like trees fall all the time, like some of them are, pine trees, you just run over them or move them out the way. It was just the confluence of things that had to transpire for every vehicle to be down. And it just, it felt more significant and meaningful, especially when you overlay kind of the experience you have as it happened. So that's one thing that happened.
That's absolutely amazing. I really appreciate you sharing that. It's such a profound story. And, I think one of the things that sets your family and your history apart is the way that you're able to bring historical context and deeply personal context to the area itself. When I remember being at the ranch and you talking about poltergeist, what other people might talk about as poltergeist activity, and you thinking of it as more, sometimes anyway, as maybe more personal symbology that might be somebody from your ancestral past reaching out.
Yeah.
Another thing along those lines, and we can dive into that further on in part 2 and etc. But one thing that we also wanted to talk about today is there's a cattle mutilation on your ranch when we came down to shoot last year, and we shot you and Dr. Stephen Finley investigating the remains. But we ended up not being able to fit it into our first season, which is deeply unfortunate in some ways. Maybe it'll come out in the future because there's this beautiful field of flowers and you guys are looking at this evidence of this cattle mutilation. You're talking about it. And it's just such a classic, absurdity in terms of like high strangeness that it's one of the most beautiful days. And it's this kind of week when the flowers come out in that field, as you said, that it's just such a brief window, and then that was there, and there's something that's so like kind of garish and ghoulish and seemingly very scary happening in that area, and also that just the raw beauty of it is really profound, and it sounded like that may have not been the first situation of a cattle mutilation like that, and maybe on your ranch or in that area. So first of all, it'd be nice to dig into this a little bit. What is a cattle mutilation in broad strokes for those that haven't heard about this phenomena? And then I'll hand it over to Kelly to kind of like push a little bit on this specific case.
Yeah. Okay. So what is a cattle mutilation? I think it's generally described as kind of an unexplained death of a cow. There's usually no indications of human, interference or activity or, tire tracks or, anything like that. Usually there's, kind of surgical like, removal of certain organs, usually the anus is removed, eyeballs are gone, there's a cheek usually kind of missing. And usually the animal's carcass is still found otherwise intact, right? Like, the coyotes haven't ripped it to shreds or anything like that. I think there's another element of it that is, I think it's reported, but I think we try to make things so technical, right? Like we try to make it like, these are the 5 things that, equal cattle mutilation or whatever. But I think there's also this thing when you talk to the individuals who's experienced it, it's always this baffling thing of like, the cow was just fine. Like I was just there. I was just checking on it. I just turned around for like a little bit, or it's like, I could see if it was that cow, but this cow, that doesn't make any sense. Right. So I think there's this subjective element that often gets left out of the story or maybe not highlighted, but I think that's what causes a rancher to say like, there was something weird, right, about this. Because there's an old saying you can't have livestock without dead stock, right? Like animals die, like animals die in childbirth, animals die because of heat stress, animals die from, disease or whatever. But you guys saw my cows, right? Like they are very healthy, like, been fully vaccinated, I'll say this too, because I go down the list of like, what could it be other than that? Right. Cause like the last thing I want to think is that it's that, could it have been, a cow dying, giving birth. Okay. Well, sure. That happens. It's not uncommon, but I want to say, somebody on the internet can check me on this, but something like 95% of the cows that die giving birth are first calf heifers, right? They're like the first calf that the cow has. When they've had 4 or 5 or 6 cows or calves before, they usually give birth like that without human intervention. Could it have been the heat stress, right? Like, well, it was like April. Like, it's not, I could see if it was August and it was 110 degrees, but it's April and the breed of cow is a Brangus cow, which you breed them with, Brahman so that they're more heat tolerant, right? And can handle heat stress. Otherwise they wouldn't be living in Texas in the first place. So, it wasn't that. Could it have been like a viral bacterial infection? Well, they're up to date on all their shots and my neighbor's cows didn't die, so, maybe the cow is sick and it's like, okay, well, why didn't it go in the woods and die in the woods or go, to die in the pond? I can understand that. Maybe it was trying to get some water and cool off or something, but like to like the location where it's like out in the middle of the field, right on the fence border, was also really interesting. The guy that cut our hay, right? So cutting hay is like a 3-day process, right? Like, so the first day you cut it, then you got to come back, after a day or two, you let it dry and you let it cure before you bale it up, right? Because that's dry before you bale it up or it catch on fire, interestingly enough. So he comes and cuts the hay on Friday. I'm there. I'm feeding the cows out of my hand, like giving them treats and stuff, like, and he comes back on Monday to bale the hay and he finds the cow. Well, I found the cow before he did, but he even made a comment on Friday, like, man, your cows are so healthy. They look so good coming out of winter. Like, man, like that mama cow right there, like, man, she's pretty. Like, it's, it's like the prize cow, like the leader of the herd, the most beautiful cow, my favorite cow, right? And one that everybody notices. And it's like, why that one, and then why that location? I'll talk a little bit more about that too. So I think part of it is that subjective piece, which I think is probably more interesting than the objective stuff. Yes, there had been people who reported, cattle mutilation. I think there were like 2, probably within a month of that happened prior to within like 30 miles or something. And I think I sent you guys the articles and stories on that because someone had told me about it before something happened to mine. And I don't know, like, part of me was, I'll tell you this too, that Friday before I left, I was feeding her out of my hand and I'm like, all right, I got to go back to Dallas and hop in the truck. I'm leaving. And as I'm leaving the ranch, I see the buzzards start circling, and they're circling the very spot where I ended up finding her on Monday. But I know she wasn't dead on Friday when I just fed her, like before I left. I was feeding her across the fence line, like feeding her, hopped in my truck, drove down the road. As I'm driving down, I'm looking up, I see these buzzards circling, and I'm just like, oh crap, I need to go back because, maybe there's something going on. Like maybe sometimes they do that if a cow's giving birth, right? Because some of these buzzards are pretty aggressive. Like they'll try to actually eat the calf, like while it's like freshly born or whatever. So you gotta watch them. But it was this weird thing of like, and there's also the lore of people saying that and like my grandma used to tell me this too, and like a lot of people in that part of the country talk about it, how like buzzards will circle before a death, like they almost know in advance, right? And like if you see that happening, like you gotta pay attention to it. But I just didn't have time to turn around and go back. And so, you start adding all this stuff up, and it's like, okay, well, there's somebody else reported cattle mutilations, like within a shorter period of time, the location, the buzzard circling. I don't know. So, and I don't necessarily like to talk about it because the other concern I have is like, is there some effect of you talking about this or thinking about this that actually brings it about? Because one of the thoughts I had before this happened was, I was like, well, heck, given all the craziness in my family and the craziness I've experienced, if cattle mutilations are a thing, like I'm going to find out real quick as soon as I get some cows, like if that's really a thing, right? And like that was kind of like the joke I kind of told myself. And within 6 months of owning cattle, like that was like the first time I found one, right? And my grandma was with me that Friday too, matter of fact, and she saw her too, and she was there on Monday, and she was stunned too. So I don't know. I'm talking about it because I think it's relevant to the story. Could it have been natural causes? Maybe. I kind of hope so, to be honest, if I'm being honest, could it have been some teenager shooting guns and like, I didn't see any bullet holes, like, and people don't generally do that. And, in that area, nobody, my neighbors didn't hear anybody shooting, like.
Well, in the pictures you showed me, it looked very much like a classic cattle mutilation case. And so, I mean, sure, it could have been those things, but it's fascinating that it kind of, like the lips were missing and it had a lot of those classic hallmarks.
Yeah.
The other thing that's remarkable about it, I think, at least to this story, is that, you and I had talked for just in DMs here and there. You had told me like the teeniest little bit of your story but I always had a feeling about it. And you and I have had so many synchronicities in our communication that kind of led us to this point. But at the time that you, and I think this is a few months after the cattle mutilation happened, but you were just like at the point that you were ready to talk about some of the things that had gone on. And so you reached out. You hadn't reached out for a few months, and you reached out with those photos. And I was at that moment researching cattle mutilations for an episode that I actually never aired on my old podcast because, frankly, they creep me out as well. And I kind of just decided not to go down that route. But if it hadn't been, that was sort of the conversation that led to us even covering your story. That was the first time you told me your whole story. Like, we got on the phone and you told me the whole thing, and it was unbelievable. And if it hadn't been for that and that kind of synchronicity, I don't know that your story even would have made it into Cosmosis. So it's kind of crazy.
That's crazy. So, I mean, it is funny because what I had those pictures I didn't even want to take the pictures, right? Like, because I think the part that people don't understand, and maybe I get it now, is like, you know, it's kind of like your dog dying, right? Like, like, I mean, a lot of people, like, cows are like smarter than dogs. They're sentient beings. Like don't get it twisted, right? They have personalities. They remember you. They have feelings, all of that. But then there's an economic component, right? Because like they're worth a lot of money, and like when you lose a cow, you lost a calf, and like there's economic component to it. There's the like personal safety of like, okay, if you could do this to a 1,000-pound animal, like what could you do to me? There's all these layers to it that make it just really difficult. And like I remember calling, like then the question, who do you call, right? Like, this happens, like you call the vet, and like I call the vet, I'm like, hey, I want to get someone to do was it a necropsy on the animal and kind of figure out what happened. Like, are there broken bones? Like, was she pregnant? Like I want to figure out all the things, but it's like they're not going to come out. They're like literally said, like, listen, we got living cows we got to worry about. Like, we're not going to drive all the way out the city and work on, like, if you want to load her up on a trailer and bring her down here, we'll take a look at her. And it's like, okay, then do you go and load up a dead cow on your trailer and drive it through town and then you bring it back? Like the logistics of it is kind of crazy. The emotional aspect of it is challenging. And so I think it's a really tough thing to get to the bottom of, because again, like there's no group that investigates this stuff and comes out. The other thing too, I'll add to this, right? So, and I don't know if I think I did talk to you guys about this, but one of the things I had been looking for was one of the first ancestors who was a descendant of who actually came over from Africa and was killed on the property, right? And the story, at least that my grandmother told me, was that the wife of the slave owner had been teaching him how to read and how to write, and was pretty much, letting him live in the house and kind of giving him very special treatment, right? And it was because her son had murdered his mother at the slave auction after she was bought. Like the son tried to rape her, and she fought back, and then he killed her. I don't know if he was trying to kill her, but he hit her in the head with a rock and she died. So the mom felt really guilty and went and bought the two sons of that slave woman. Okay. So she now, mom feels guilty for what her son did. So she's raising him less like a slave, if you will, teaching him how to read and write. Gave them a plot of that land to grow their own potatoes, sweet potatoes and things like that grow really well there. Grow their potatoes, and they would take them to the market, write a note. They would write the note, but say it was on behalf and forge the signature of the slave owner, and go take the note to the market, sell their potatoes, keep the money. And that was their way of kind of saving up to make it to freedom. So when the slave owner found out about this, he told them, you got to get out of here. You got to leave, or I'm going to kill you. So he left and ran off into the woods, but he didn't want to leave his wife and kids. And so he came back that night for his family and, got his wife and kids over the fence. According to my grandmother, threw his potatoes over the fence. And then when he went to go over the fence, the slave owner shot him and killed him right there on the fence line. Now, I was asked, like, what happened to his body? Like, where did they bury him? Like, all this kind of stuff. And, it was never, my grandma was like, look, back in that days, we don't know. Like, the body could have been buried somewhere on the property. They could have fed it to the dogs. Like, we don't know, at that time. And so that was one thing as part of this whole family history project I was doing. I was trying to figure out, where did this murder happen on the property? Where, would his body have been buried? Like, I just wanted to find out and put the pieces of that puzzle together. But I kind of had come reserved to the fact that I may never find that information, because, like, how would you figure that out? Well, the interesting thing about this cattle mutilation was that it was found right on the fence line, and having done some more historical work about where the slave owner's house was, where the nearest road was to get out, if I were trying to escape, I would have gone, away from the master's house, right? Kind of going out the back way to the back road, back to the back way. So it's just really interesting that, like, I found this cow dead on this fence line at what I would presume would be the route that I would have taken if I was trying to escape from slavery. And there's still a post there from, like, the old fence where you just kind of go. And so part of me is like, is that part of this too? Right.
Wow.
Like, I don't know, but it's a lot,
It's amazing.
It is a lot. And it's, it was so powerful for, I think, the whole team to be on that property. Before we kind of went up to the house and everything, we stopped at the cemetery on the way in. And I really felt like I felt the presence of your ancestors there. And that, we stood in that place and kind of had a reverent moment, and sort of, I think we all kind of spoke to them and were like, you've brought us all here. And if that was the case, if that cattle mutilation did happen in that place, and that was exactly the ancestor that you were looking for, and that ancestor didn't just bring you to that land, but then through that whole story brought us and our whole camera crew and team to the ranch to tell that story. Like, there was this kind of full circle moment there where it felt like I just remember being really humbled and feeling like that this was a story that was bigger than any one of us, and that we'd been brought there for a reason to tell this story. And it was just, for me, of all the cool things and strange moments and everything that happened in Cosmosis, I think that moment in the cemetery for me was probably the most meaningful. And it's been such a privilege and an honor, and so it's such a growth moment, I think, to be a part of, this play a very small part in your family story. And so I guess I just want to thank you for, like, sharing that with us and letting us be a part of it. That's it for this episode of the Cosmosis Conversations. Cosmosis is brought to you by Ontocalypse Productions. If you want to check out our docuseries, Cosmosis, UFOs A New Reality, head over to cosmosis.media to find out where to watch. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and ring the bell for notifications. It really helps the show, and it keeps the conversation going. Music for the Cosmosis Conversations is by Michael Rubino. The soundtrack for Season 1 of Cosmosis is now available on all major music streaming platforms, and you'll find links in the episode description. If you want to go even deeper and support our work, join us on Patreon. You'll get early access to ad-free episodes, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and monthly Zoom calls with us and our special guests. You can sign up now at patreon.com/cosmosismedia. And we'll see you next week for part 2 of our conversation with Courtney Leffall. You don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.